So if you're a church planner or in ministry, there's a good chance that you either now currently or in the future are going to work pretty close with your spouse. So today on the podcast, I'm joined by a pretty special guest, and we give you 4 tips on how to work better with your spouse in ministry. Well, welcome back to Practical Church Planting, where in 15 minutes or less, we'll give you practical tips, advice, and encouragement to help you plant and grow healthy churches. My name is Brian Drosian. Joining me isn't Dylan, like normally is if you're watching the video, but it is Brittany, my wife. And today we're talking about 4 ways to work better with your spouse in ministry. The two of us have worked together in different capacities for kind of a long time, right? In ministry and outside of ministry. And so we want to take some time because as church planners, it's kind of your spouse is kind of your first teammate, kind of defaults as your first teammate. So I want to talk about some tips on how to work better with your spouse in ministry. Before we kind of get into the list, I wanted to make a little disclaimer and talk a little bit about why or why not to work with your spouse. If you're a lead pastor or a planter, your spouse is going to be your partner, is going to be, your partner in doing the whole thing, but doesn't mean they need to be necessarily a staff member. Right. So I wanted to kind of talk about a few reasons why you may want to or why you may not want to work together. That might sound bad, but you know what I mean. So the first reason kind of why it's kind of a good idea to work together is nobody knows you better than your spouse. Correct. Right? So nobody knows you better. No one knows how to work with you better or knows your personality better than your spouse does. You can bring people on that have strengths that you don't, but in reality, your spouse is the person who has the most strengths that you don't. Fair?
That's true.
Fair. Yes. But kind of the little disclaimer we want to give is that it may not be for everybody. That just because you're a pastor doesn't mean that your wife has to be a staff member. Correct. Right? We kind of see that a lot, that the wife kind of is the first staff member, is the first person that, takes on a big role. And while they are very important, they're just as important probably as the pastor is, but they don't necessarily have to be a full-time vocational ministry, full-time staff member. And we'll kind of go over some reasons for that in a little bit, but we just want to kind of get that out of the way, that there's nothing wrong with not wanting to work together or really not working together well. Right.
I would say here at our church, yes, our pastor's wife is not on staff here at New City Church, and for different reasons, but it's okay to not be on staff. Yeah. It's not like a better or worse thing. I think that's a strength that you got to recognize, that you may work well together or you may be great partners in life, but not the best work partners. And that's fine. But let's get into our 4 reasons of how, or 4 ways of how to work better together if you do decide to work together. The first way, or the first tip we'll give, is to recognize where you work well together and where you don't. So if you do decide to work together, obviously that's great, but just because you decide to work together doesn't mean you work great in every facet of ministry or in every area. Kind of share a little bit about us. We've worked together for a long time, but there are definitely areas that we don't work super well together. We have, if you've ever gotten to know us, we have very different personalities. And so one of those things is when it's in more of a creative brainstorming area, we do not work well together. And mostly I just make her mad. Is that fair? Yes, I lead the creative team here at our church, and Brian is the first person to shoot an idea down when we have them. And so instead of being more brainstorming and creative with me, it just is best to see if he's not in the room when we're doing that.
That's right. I like being creative, and I like brainstorming when people agree with my ideas or when people listen to me. But yeah, I'm not great at just throwing ideas out there without giving any negative feedback, I guess, which can be a strength, but can really be a weakness too.
I was also just going to say, on the flip side, I run the kids ministry here at our church, and I recognize too where we do work really well together. And so Brian is very good at the technical side and technology, and I am not. And so Brian gets all my check-ins set up. He's able to make sure that we are running well on a technology standpoint, and I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah. So there's areas that you work together well and areas you don't, and that's not a good or bad thing. People just have different personalities. If your spouse has the exact same personality than you, then that sounds awful. I mean, that sounds miserable. So you have places that you work well together and places that you don't, and it's good just to recognize those things, and they'll make working together much more tolerable. Yeah. Tip number 2, don't take conflict personally. I think this is a big one, because if you work together in any capacity, there's going to be conflict at some point, and to recognize that conflict or that disagreement or whatever it is not a personal attack at the other person. Right. This is really a tip for working with anyone in general, but it's much more important when working with your spouse, that there's going to be disagreements. There's going to be things you don't agree on. But if you kind of take that home and dwell on it, it's going to make working together and really marriage miserable.
I think too, when you have a healthy church, you have a healthy staff, you're able to argue and disagree with each other and still be able to move forward. If you ever sit in one of our staff meetings, we argue all the time in a healthy way. We're able to discuss and talk about what's happening. But as women, we typically take these things harder than men do, and so it can be hard not to take it home with us when you work with your spouse. And so I have been guilty of that before, having a disagreement with someone that leads hospitality and then having a disagreement with my husband here at the church. I take the one with my husband home, and so being able to recognize a church conflict is a church conflict and be able to move past it.
Yeah, like let's just open up. We have a kind of little situation or whatever we're dealing with right now where one of the things I do here is a lot of the financial things at New City. And there's a software that Brittany wants us to get. Doesn't really matter what it is to go into, but it's not in our budget. And so she wants to make it happen, and I can't make it happen. And so instead of just shutting her down and saying no the second time, first time I shut her down and said no. That was not wise. But instead of continuing that and just shutting it down and saying no and not being willing to talk about it, kind of making a bitter situation out of it or kind of making a conflict more than it needed to be, instead, even though I couldn't just make that decision to make it happen because I don't have the power to do that, I've told her what would need to be done and then help her potentially work on those steps that we would need to take to make that happen. So it's just kind of recognizing that there's going to be times where you butt heads and times where disagreements, whether they're personal or not, but instead of taking them personally, recognize how you can actually help each other in that situation.
Yeah.
Make sense? Mm-hmm. Tip number 3, don't let your marriage revolve around ministry. Mm-hmm. Don't make it the center of your life, which is hard because it seems like that should be the most important thing. I mean, obviously there's lives at stake, there's souls at stake, so it is very important. And so it's easy just to let that be the number one thing in your life and in your marriage. But I think you would agree, and I think most people would agree that that's a very unhealthy way to live, for that to be the sole focus of your marriage instead of each other or instead of God.
Right.
If
your marriage isn't healthy, your ministry is not going to be healthy either. And we ran into this a couple weeks ago. There is a women's group here that meets on Friday mornings, and I really wanted to be a part of it. I really wanted to help lead it and help grow it. But Friday is our days to connect with each other, and Friday is our days that we take time together as a married couple without kids, without work. And though I wanted to do it, I wasn't able to sacrifice my marriage for that. And not that you are sacrificing your marriage for anything, but that you're making sure your marriage is a priority. You're making sure that you have a healthy relationship. You can't lead others if you're not there yourself.
Yeah, that's really good. One kind of way to gauge this, because I think we've fallen into this kind of, it's not trap, but fallen into this before where kind of ministry was more of a focus of our marriage than it should have been in the past. And one kind of way, I didn't make this up, but one kind of way to gauge this that I remember reading is to just look at your conversations. Like, is every conversation about the church? Is every conversation about ministry in general? And if it is, then not that you can't talk about it, obviously it's a big part of your life, but if that's all you're talking about or the only kind of connection that you have anymore, then really your ministry is the focus of your life, not your marriage, right, or not, not each other with God. It's really just focusing on the church or focusing on ministry, which isn't a healthy way to be. Mm-hmm. So number 4, last one, is make sure it's something, this sounds kind of obvious, but I don't think it's as obvious as we think it is. It's make sure it's something that you both want to do. You may be like, well, duh. But I think especially this probably falls, I'll let you speak to this in a minute, because this probably falls more to the wives and the pastors themselves, is a lot of times you kind of just fall into it, fall into being in ministry because your spouse is, or you see a lot of other couples in ministry. And so it just kind of seems like the natural thing to do to both go at it together. Mm-hmm. And I think the biggest thing is make sure it's something that you both actually want to do, not just doing it because you feel like you need to.
Right.
Yeah. And I think if you're just doing it for the reason of we need to, or want to be supportive, and so we're going to go at this together kind of thing, it's going to end up being a lot less healthy, a lot more unhealthy than it would be if you actually want to do it.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that, our pastor's wife here at New City Church, we're a part of the Acts 29 community, and they went to a development session for the two of them, and they asked her how much she served here at New City, how much she served in our kids ministry. And she was very open. She was honest. She said, I serve every single week. I'm here. I'm willing. I'm able to. I want to be a part of it. I have experience with kids ministry. Why wouldn't I serve every week? And they gave great advice. They said to her, what's going to be worse for the church? Is it going to be that we have one less volunteer this week, or is it going to be that we have a burnout pastor's wife?
Yeah.
Because if she is burnt out and if she is not there to help be that support for him, that could fall onto the whole church. You want to make sure that you have that healthy relationship between you two again, and make sure that is both something you want to do, both something that you're pursuing, and not just doing it because you feel like you have an obligation.
Yeah, that's really good. A burnt out pastor's wife is going to be so much more detrimental to the church than, as bad as it sounds, but it's not bad than a burnt out volunteer.
Right.
So when it comes to wanting to work in ministry or wanting to be in ministry, you need to sit down, have an honest conversation, pray a lot about it, obviously, and make sure it's something that you both want to do, feel called to do, and have a passion for doing, rather than just defaulting to it because that's what everybody's doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree.
So those are 4 tips to work better with your spouse in ministry. I'll read them again real quick. It is: recognize where you work well together and where you don't. Don't take conflict personally. Don't let your marriage revolve around ministry. And make sure it's something that you both want to do. So thanks for joining us today on Practical Church Planting. As always, you can always go to practicalplanting.com/questions if you ever have any questions about working together in ministry, about marriage, about ministry, or if you just want to, drop us a line. practicalplanting.com/questions, and we'll answer whatever you drop there. Until next time, thanks for joining us on Practical Church Planting.
Thanks so much for watching this episode of Practical Church Planting. Whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or Practical Planting, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, make sure you like or subscribe or do whatever it's telling you to do or should do on that platform.
And hey, if you are so tired of looking at our ugly faces, but you're not tired of listening to our beautiful voices, then you can find our podcast if you just search Practical Church Planting on iTunes or Google Play. Make sure not to just find it, not just to listen, but to subscribe.
Make sure you subscribe. Brian, tell them to subscribe.
Subscribe.
See you next time.